The door had not been opened in centuries. Rust had fused the colossal metal wheel into its frame, a stubborn, silent guardian against the ravages of time and the desolate world outside. Harlow Vance drove his crowbar into the narrow gap with a grunt, the screech of protesting metal echoing unnaturally loud in the dead air of the canyon. For hours he worked, muscles burning, sweat tracing clean paths through the grime on his face. This was his purpose, his obsession, to find the sealed places, the buried truths. Vault 56 was a prize, its location a secret he had traded 3 clean water filters and a functional plasma pistol to obtain. The stories whispered about it were vague, ominous. They spoke of silence. With a final deafening crack, the wheel gave way. It spun freely under his hands, the sound like a great, slumbering beast drawing its first breath. A hiss of equalizing pressure escaped the seam as the door, several feet thick, began to inch inward. Harlow stepped back, raising his filtered lantern, its beam cutting a swath through the absolute blackness within. The smell hit him first, an ancient, dry decay, the scent of dust and bones left to molder in a sealed tomb. It was the smell of a story that had ended badly. He stepped across the threshold, his boots crunching on grit-covered concrete. The beam of his lantern swept across the entrance hall, a cavernous space that should have spoken of safety and order. Instead, it revealed a massacre frozen in time. Skeletons lay strewn across the floor, their poses a ghastly tableau of final, frantic moments. Some were curled in corners as if hiding, while others lay sprawled in the open, bones intertwined in a last, desperate struggle. Their clothes had long since rotted away to brittle threads, leaving the pale, clean bones exposed. There were no signs of animal scavengers, no disturbance from the outside world. This horror had been entirely self-contained. Harlow moved slowly, his breath pluming in the chill. Stagnant air, his light traced the battle scars etched into the walls, the pockmarks of high-caliber bullets, the blackened smears of old energy weapon discharges, and deep gouges from something blunt and heavy. A makeshift barricade of overturned tables and fused machinery had been erected near the inner door, now just a skeleton of its former self. The silence was a physical weight, pressing in on his eardrums, broken only by the scuff of his own footsteps. This was not the orderly cryosleep of a failed vault, nor the slow decline of a community that had simply run out of time. This was violence, sudden, brutal, and absolute. A cold knot tightened in his stomach, a familiar mix of dread and grim determination. He was an intruder in a graveyard, a witness to a tragedy whose players had been dust for generations. Yet the mystery of it pulled him forward. What could have driven people who had survived the end of the world to turn on each other with such ferocity within their own? Sanctuary, the answer was not out here in this ossuary. It lay deeper within the vault, in the darkness beyond the next door. Harlow adjusted the strap of his pack, his jaw set. He would find the truth, no matter how terrible it was. The dead of Vault 56 would not keep their secrets any longer. Beyond the tomb-like silence of the entrance hall lay the heart of Vault 56, a space that spoke of a grand, broken promise. The atrium stretched upward into a vaulted ceiling lost in shadow, a cavernous cavity that should have been a bustling center of community life. Harlow's lantern beam, a frail spear of light in the immense dark, swept across a scene of profound and violent contradiction. The ideals of the old world were plastered on the walls, warring with the brutal evidence of their failure. Faded propaganda posters, their colors bleached by time, clung stubbornly to the curved metal walls. "Our strength is our unity," one declared, depicting a multi-ethnic group of smiling, clean-faced women working in harmony. Another showed a stylized Vault-Tec logo with the slogan, "Obedience ensures survival." But these testaments to order were defaced, scarred by the very chaos they sought to prevent. Bullet holes stitched across the smiling faces, and dark, rust-colored splatters obscured the cheerful commands. The air, still and cold, carried the faint, metallic ghost of old blood beneath the dominant scent of dust and ozone. The floor was a testament to the final, desperate struggle. Furniture, metal desks, cafeteria tables, and reinforced benches had been dragged into a haphazard maze of barricades, creating choke points and defensive positions. Harlow moved through them like an archaeologist navigating a forgotten battlefield. He paused beside one such barricade, his light illuminating the skeleton of a woman slumped behind it, the bones of her hands still curled around the rusted frame of a laser rifle. She had died facing the inner doors, a last sentinel in a war that had consumed everything. His attention was then drawn to a flicker of light in the far wall. Nestled within a recessed alcove, shielded by a half-collapsed desk, was a functioning terminal. Its screen glowed with a sickly, unstable green, casting a pulsating light that made the shadows in the atrium seem to breathe. A thin layer of dust coated the console, but the power indicator shone steadily. It was a miracle it still worked, a lone, flickering neuron in the vault's dead brain. Harlow brushed the dust away, the keys feeling stiff and gritty under his fingers. He initiated a system boot, his heart thudding with a scholar's anticipation. The screen stuttered to life, lines of text scrambling into view before dissolving into blocks of corrupted code. Glimpses of coherent data flashed like fish in murky water, fragments of personnel files, inventory lists, and security protocols, all truncated and glitched. One recurring string of corrupted text stood out: file, OVRCER log 001, data. Stream COMPR. It was a maddening tease, a digital ghost hinting at the story locked within the machine's damaged memory banks. The terminal was a chronicle of the fall, but its pages were torn and scattered, its narrative shattered into 1,000 indecipherable pieces. The decay was not just in the bones and the broken barricades, it was in the very data, the memory of this place, eroding into digital static. The first clues to the societal breakdown were here, whispering from the dead screens and the scarred walls, a puzzle whose missing pieces promised only horror. The terminal's screen flickered, a dying ember of logic in a tomb of madness. Harlow worked with a scavenger's patience, his fingers navigating the corrupted file structure, bypassing broken protocols with a series of commands learned in a dozen other dead places. He was a digital exorcist, trying to summon a ghost from the machine. After an hour of painstaking effort, the screen stabilized, the chaotic scramble of code coalescing into a single, partially restored text file. The header was stark and official: OVRCER log 001 Vault 56 Sociobiological Initiative. He leaned closer, the green light washing over his face, and began to read the cold, clinical words that would unravel the first layer of Vault 56's horror. The log was a dry, administrative report, its tone utterly detached from the human catastrophe it had set in motion. It detailed the Vault's true purpose, a secret experiment designed by Vault Tech to study the long-term effects of extreme gender imbalance on social dynamics. The numbers were stated with chilling simplicity. The Vault's population was to consist of 1,000 genetically viable female subjects and a single male. His name was Leo. The primary objective was to monitor the formation of social hierarchies, the development of belief systems, and the potential for resource-based conflict in a scenario where the most fundamental biological resource, the potential for procreation, was artificially and drastically constrained. The log elaborated on the mechanisms of this constraint. A sophisticated automated fertility suppression system was integrated into the Vault's air and water supply, a permanent, invisible barrier against pregnancy. The overseer's notes described it as a necessary control for the experiment, a way to isolate the social variables from the biological ones. The language was that of a lab technician observing rats in a maze, not a leader shepherding a community through the apocalypse. There were notes on psychological profiling of the female subjects, selected for a range of personality types to encourage diverse group formation, and a single, chilling line about subject Leo, primary male subject selected for genetic optimality and baseline psychological resilience. Integration protocols to be observed. Harlow leaned back from the screen, a cold dread seeping into his bones that had nothing to do with the Vault's atmospheric chill. The skeletons in the atrium, the bullet-scarred posters, the final, desperate barricades, they were not the result of some external monster or a simple failure of supplies. They were the preordained conclusion of a monstrously unethical equation. He imagined the first days, the 1,000 women and the one man, sealed inside this steel tomb, told they were the hope for humanity's future, all while being unwitting pawns in a callous, scientific game. The propaganda posters promoting unity were a sick joke, a layer of paint over a foundation designed to crack. The unease he felt was a moral revulsion, a profound disgust for the architects of this place who had treated human lives as data points. The horror of Vault 56 was not an accident, it was a meticulously planned tragedy, and he was now reading its blueprint. In the sterile, humming quiet of the Vault's first year, a fragile rhythm was born from the chaos of arrival. The initial shock of sealed doors and the loss of the sky gave way to the slow, deliberate work of building a life in a world of recycled air and artificial sunsets. The women, 1,000 souls selected for their resilience, fell into the patterns of survival with a practiced ease that belied the strangeness of their new reality. They manned the hydroponics bays, their hands tending rows of luminous greens under grow lights. They maintained the shivering machinery of life support, their voices a low murmur in the engine rooms. A society, minute and self-contained, began to coalesce around the shared tasks of existence. And at the center of this nascent world was Leo, the solitary man. His integration was a spectacle of cautious choreography, observed and documented with the cold eye of the experiment. He was given his own quarters, a small, functional room that felt more like an exhibit than a home. When he moved through the common areas, the mess hall, the recreation lounge, the atrium, a subtle current shifted the atmosphere. Conversations would dip into silence, then resume at a slightly higher pitch. Eyes followed him, 1,000 flickering glances that held a confusing cocktail of emotions. There was a clinical curiosity, the kind one might reserve for a rare and potentially dangerous specimen. There was a flicker of resentment, a silent accusation of the unnatural burden his mere existence represented. And beneath it all, a low, thrumming undercurrent of something deeper, a biological and social fascination that the vault's architects had coldly anticipated. Leo moved through this gauntlet of attention with a quiet deference. He took his meals at the end of a long table, eating quickly and alone unless specifically invited to join a group, an event that was always stiff, overly polite, and fraught with unspoken questions. He performed his assigned duties in the water purification sector with silent efficiency, his presence there tolerated but never fully integrated. The women's interactions with him were a study. Controlled tension, some offered shy smiles that never reached their eyes. Others ignored him with a pointed intensity that was as telling as any stare. He was a walking paradox, the most watched person in the vault and yet the most profoundly isolated. The first fissures were subtle, hairline cracks in the facade of unity. They appeared not in dramatic confrontations, but in the quiet allocation of resources. A slightly larger portion of fresh fruit from hydroponics would find its way to his tray. A newer, less patched jumpsuit would be issued to him while others made do with worn fabric. These small privileges were granted without fanfare, but they were noted. Whispers began to circulate in the dormitories at lights out, not of malice, but of a dawning, unsettling awareness. The vault's structure, its very purpose, had placed an impossible weight on one man's shoulders and had given 1,000 women a shared, complicated focus for their hopes, their fears, and their burgeoning. Resentments, the harmony of those early days, was a thin veneer, and beneath it, the pressures of the experiment had already begun their slow, inexorable work. The fragile harmony of the vault's first year could not withstand the slow, corrosive drip of human nature. As the initial shock of confinement faded, the vacuum of purpose began to fill with the oldest of social forces, the drive for order, for influence, for control. Informal hierarchies, once fluid and based on competence, began to harden into structures of power. Women who had been engineers or medics in the old world naturally assumed leadership in maintenance and medical, but new roles emerged, born entirely from the vault's unique pressures. A woman named Althea, with a commanding presence and a voice that carried, began organizing work schedules and resource distribution with an efficiency that bordered on authoritarian. Others, like the quiet, analytical Isolde, garnered a different kind of influence through her calm logic and understanding of the vault's complex systems. These nascent leaders, however, did not go unchallenged. Factions of resistance formed not as organized rebellions but as cliques of discontent. Some women resented the new chain of command, seeing it as a betrayal of the communal ideal touted by the faded posters. Their resentment found a focal point in the subtle, yet increasingly visible, privileges afforded to Leo. His slightly larger living quarters, his first access to any rare luxury from the deep storage, even the simple fact that he never had to wait in line, these small inequities became symbols of a skewed system. Disputes once whispered now simmered into open arguments in the mess hall over who had the right to sit with him, or whose turn it was to deliver his maintenance reports. Leo himself became a prize, his attention a currency of status. Harlow, in the cold silence of the present, found the physical scars of these early divisions. He moved beyond the public spaces into the residential sectors, a honeycomb of identical doors lining long, gloomy corridors. Here, the uniformity of vault tech design had been overwritten by the inhabitants. Outside one cluster of doors, he found faint, ghostly outlines where symbols had been carefully scrubbed away, the metal left slightly smoother than its surroundings. Further down the hall, another set of quarters showed a different story. Scratched into the paint near a doorframe was a small, crude circle, and across from it, a matching gear-shaped engraving. They were simple, almost childish, but their placement was deliberate, a silent declaration of allegiance, a territorial marking from a time when ideological lines were first being drawn in the dust. Returning to the terminal, Harlow accessed another fragmented log, this one a sociological update from the overseer. It documented these primary ideological splits with clinical interest. The log described the emergence of two broad, opposing philosophies. One group, the precursors to what would become the rationalists, advocated for a strict, merit-based structure and the unwavering maintenance of the vault systems, including the fertility suppression. They viewed the emotional tensions surrounding Leo as a dangerous, irrational variable to be managed. The other, less defined group argued for a more fluid, empathetic social model, some even questioning the ethics of the suppression itself, seeing in Leo not just a man, but a symbol of a future that had been artificially denied. The log's final, preserved line was a masterwork of understated horror. Subject cohesion is degrading at a projected rate. Social fragmentation parameters are being met. The seeds of power struggle have successfully germinated. Harlow looked from the screen to the scratched symbols on the wall, understanding that he was seeing the first, tentative roots of the poison tree that would eventually strangle the entire vault. The symbols were a plague spreading through the vault's sterile corridors like a virulent, silent confession. Harlow moved deeper into the residential sectors, his lantern beam tracing the story etched into the very walls. The simple circle and gear he had first noticed were no longer isolated marks. They had multiplied, becoming more intricate, more defiant. The circle was often carved with a flowing, almost reverent hand, sometimes enclosed within a larger, protective ring. The gear, in contrast, was etched with sharp, precise lines, its cogs and teeth rendered with a machinist's cold accuracy. They faced each other across hallway junctions, marked the doors of opposing quarters, and were even scratched into the floors, creating invisible borders in the dust. The vault was no longer a unified entity. It was a map of two warring nations drawn in scarred metal. His exploration led him to a disused maintenance closet, its door jammed shut by a collapsed ceiling panel. Levering it open, he was met not with the expected tangle of pipes and tools, but with a carefully organized cache of violence. Crates stacked neatly against the far wall had been pried open. Inside, nestled in decaying packing foam, lay the sleek, deadly shapes of laser pistols, their power cells long since drained to inertness. Next to them were boxes of conventional ballistic ammunition, the brass casings glinting dully, and a collection of shock batons, their handles worn from anxious grips. This was not a random armory, it was a hidden stockpile, a deliberate preparation for a conflict everyone must have seen brewing in the tense, silent air. The weapons spoke of a cold, pragmatic foresight, a chilling acceptance that the war of symbols would inevitably become a war of blood and energy fire. In the present, the silence of the hidden armory was absolute, but in Harlow's mind, the echoes of the past were rising to a clamor. He could almost hear them, the arguments that had once reverberated through these halls. Their heat a stark contrast to the vault's perpetual chill. The debates over Leo's role escalated from whispered grievances to shouted ultimatums. One faction saw him as a resource to be protected, managed, and utilized for a future they sought to logically engineer. The other began to speak of him in terms that were anything but logical, as a figure of destiny, a key, a singular hope in their sealed world. The arguments were no longer about extra fruit or a newer jumpsuit. They were about the fundamental meaning of their existence, and Leo was the unwilling fulcrum upon which all their ideologies balanced. The shared trauma of their confinement, the pressure cooker environment of the experiment, had not brought them together. It had shattered them, amplifying their differences until the only thing they shared was the space of their mutual destruction. Leaving the closet, Harlow ran his fingers over a deep gouge in the wall, a scar from a blade or a tool swung in fury. The physical division of the vault was now complete. He stood at the intersection of two corridors, one marked with a freshly painted stark white circle, the other with a similarly new gear. The symbols were no longer timid scratches, they were bold declarations of territory and belief. The hidden weapons proved that both sides were ready to fight for that belief, to turn their sealed sanctuary into a battlefield. The fragmentation was no longer a sociological parameter in a corrupted log, it was a tangible, chilling reality. The vault had cleaved itself in two, and the chasm between the circle and the gear was now too wide for anything but violence to cross. In the suffocating silence of the vault, where logic had begun to curdle and hope was a dwindling resource, a new kind of faith took root. It did not bloom in the light of the atrium or the ordered spaces of the rationalists, but in the shadowed corners and whispered conversations of the desperate. It began not with a divine revelation, but with a simple human need for something to believe in beyond the sterile walls and the slow, grinding decay of their future. And so, the cult of the One was born, its genesis a quiet, fervent turning away from the cold equations of their existence toward the warm, terrifying light of devotion. Their rituals started small, almost innocuous. A woman would leave her daily protein ration on a small, cloth-draped crate outside Leo's quarters, bowing her head for a moment before scurrying away. Another would sketch his likeness on a scrap of recycled polymer, her lines imbuing his features with a serene, otherworldly grace he never possessed in life. These were not acts of romance or simple affection, they were offerings, gestures of supplication to the only unique variable in their closed system. As the vault's social fabric frayed, these gestures coalesced into a structured belief. Leo was no longer just a man, he was the one, the singular male, the potential source of life in a place. Designed for sterility, he became a divine figure, a living god crafted from loneliness and the profound, unnatural pressure of the experiment. Harlow discovered the physical heart of their devotion in a sublevel storage room, its door sealed not by a lock but by a heavy cabinet that had been painstakingly dragged in front of it. Moving the obstruction, he was met with a scene that was both poignant and deeply unsettling. The room had been transformed into a shrine. In the center, on an upturned cargo crate serving as an altar, stood a crude statuette fashioned from fused scrap metal and wire, its form vaguely humanoid. It was surrounded by a halo of carefully arranged objects, a locket containing a faded lock of dark hair, a child's toy salvaged from deep storage, and neat piles of preserved food rations, all untouched. The walls were covered in drawings and symbols, the flowing circle repeated like a sacred mandala. The air was thick with the scent of old dust and something else, the faint, sweet smell of incense that had been burned centuries ago. This was a place of reverence, but the reverence was tinged with a desperate, possessive control. They worshipped Leo, but they also sought to contain him, to channel his perceived power for their own salvation. Among the offerings, tucked beneath the altar cloth, Harlow found a small, leather-bound diary. The pages were filled with a tight, looping script, the ink faded to brown. It belonged to a woman named Alara. Her words were not those of a revolutionary or a scientist, but of a true believer. "The one does not speak to me, not with words," she wrote, "but in the quiet of the night I feel his presence, a warmth in the chill of this metal tomb. The others, the gear-marked ones, they see only a component, a biological function. They are blind, they seek to solve an equation, but we have found the answer. He is the answer. My devotion is my anchor. When I leave my offering, I feel a peace that their logic can never provide. They want to control the future with schematics and data. We will shape it with faith. He is ours to protect, to venerate. In his silence I hear the voice of a new beginning." Her fervent devotion was a shield against the terror of meaninglessness, a beautiful, terrifying lie that gave purpose to a life trapped in a cage. The cult of the One, once a fringe gathering of the desperate, began to metastasize, its tendrils of influence coiling around the very structure of Vault society. Their belief was no longer a quiet comfort, it was a political tool, a cudgel of authority. The women who had risen to leadership within the cult, figures like the charismatic Althea, realized that their divine mandate was the ultimate source of power. They began to issue decrees, not from the overseer's office, but from their shadowy shrine, their words framed as the sacred will of the One. Leo's name was invoked to justify everything from the reallocation of medical supplies to their followers to the enforcement of new, rigid codes of conduct. To question the cult was to question Leo himself, a blasphemy that was swiftly and publicly condemned. He had become a living symbol, a silent, unwilling king whose throne was a prison of expectation and fear. This consolidation of power did not go unchallenged. The women outside the cult, particularly those aligning with the emerging rationalist faction, watched this rise with a cold, mounting fury. They saw not a divine figure, but a pawn, a man being stripped of his humanity and propped up as a puppet to legitimize a theocratic coup. Conflicts erupted daily, no longer just verbal sparring but physical confrontations in the corridors. A rationalist engineer, attempting to perform a systems check near the shrine, was set upon by a group of devotees who accused her of profaning holy ground. A cult member caught distributing devotional pamphlets in the hydroponics bay had her materials confiscated and destroyed by a stern-faced botanist who spat the word superstition like a curse. The vault was cleaving into two armed camps, and Leo was the territory over which they fought, his every movement, every glance analyzed and weaponized by both sides. The rituals of the cult grew more extreme, more possessive as their power solidified. The simple offerings of food evolved into elaborate ceremonies of light and sound, using salvaged equipment to create flickering displays in the darkened shrine. Then came the most disturbing development, documented in a heavily corrupted log Harlow managed to partially restore. The cult instituted symbolic marriages to the One. In a twisted parody of union, select high-ranking devotees would participate in a ceremony, pledging their eternal fidelity and service to Leo. He was made to sit upon a makeshift throne, a crown of woven wires placed upon his head, as these women would kneel, one by one, and have their hands bound with a silken cord, a token representing their sacred bond. The log described these events with a disturbing mix of clinical observation and evident horror, the author noting Leo's rigid posture, his eyes distant and glazed, a man dissociating from his own life as it was ritualistically dismantled around him. Harlow read these fragmented entries, the corrupted text glitching and skipping like a damaged memory. He saw the pattern clearly. A belief system born from genuine despair had distorted under the immense pressure of isolation and the hunger for control. It had twisted devotion into dominion and faith into fanaticism. The cult of the One no longer sought solace in their God, they sought to wield him. They used his perceived divinity to command obedience, to punish dissent, and to sanctify their own escalating authority. The pressure of the Vault's impossible reality had not created a new religion of peace, but a ruthless theocracy, proving that even the most sacred of beliefs could be corrupted into a weapon when survival was stripped down to its most brutal, primal instincts. As the cult of the One wove its tapestry of superstition and control, a counterforce emerged from the Vault's logical core, a faction born not from faith but from a cold, unwavering devotion to reason. The rationalists coalesced in the engineering bays and science labs, their philosophy a stark antithesis to the fervent whispers echoing from the shrine. They saw the cult's deification of Leo not as a spiritual awakening, but as a catastrophic regression, a surrender to primitive impulses that threatened to unravel the last threads of their civilization. Their creed was simple, brutal, and absolute: order through logic, survival through system maintenance, and the complete rejection of the emotional contagion they believed was poisoning the vault. Their primary objective became the preservation of the vault's original, intended state. While the cult sought to elevate Leo to a god, the rationalists worked obsessively to maintain the automated fertility suppression system, viewing it as the most crucial control mechanism of the entire experiment. They documented its performance metrics with fanatical precision, calibrating filters and monitoring chemical dosages in the air and water supply. To them, a failure of this system was not a potential for new life, but the trigger for ultimate social collapse, a descent into a biological free-for-all that would make their current ideological war look like a petty squabble. They saw themselves as the last guardians of the vault's scientific integrity, the only ones who understood that their survival depended on upholding the cold, artificial order that had been imposed upon them. Harlow found their legacy not in shrines, but in manifests. In a climate-controlled data archive adjacent to the medical bay, he discovered a stack of pristine polymer slates, each one filled with the tight, unadorned script of the rationalist leadership. These were not personal diaries, they were clinical reports, sociological dissections of the vault's decay. They cataloged the cult's growing influence with the detached interest of an entomologist studying an invasive hive. They analyzed resource allocation conflicts, charted the rise of violence, and proposed models for societal stabilization through stricter resource rationing and the enforced segregation of faction members. Their language was devoid of pity or outrage. It was a language of variables, parameters, and projected failure points. Their solution to the human suffering around them was not compassion, but more efficient control. One slate, labeled Leadership Log Isolde, contained the most chilling articulation of their philosophy. The author, presumably the faction's leader, wrote with a scalpel-like precision that cut away all humanity from her subjects. The emotional responses of the deviant faction are a predictable, if regrettable, data point, the log stated. Their turn to superstition is a failure of cognitive discipline, a surrender to base neurological impulses triggered by confinement and biological frustration. Our efforts to reason with them are wasted. You cannot debate a malfunction. The only viable path is containment and the rigid enforcement of systemic protocols. The male subject, Leo, is now a primary catalyst for the instability. His continued existence in his current symbolic role presents an unacceptable variable. Sentiment must be excised from the equation for the preservation of the whole. The needs of the many, quantified and logical, outweigh the hysterical desires of the few. The entry was a masterpiece of utilitarian coldness, a leader's disdain for emotion laid bare in a stark confession that saw people not as souls, but as problems to be solved, even if the solution was monstrous. The deeper Harlow ventured into the vault's residential sectors, the more the sterile, metallic corridors gave way to the ghostly imprint of lived lives. He moved from the public spaces of conflict into the private sanctuaries of the dead, and here the horror became intimate. Each door he pushed open was a breach into a personal history, a small, sealed world frozen at the moment of its ending. The air in these quarters was thicker, laden with the dust of decayed fabric and forgotten dreams. His lantern beam swept across bedrooms and small living areas, illuminating not the grand drama of factional war, but the quiet, heartbreaking minutiae of 1,000 individual existences. He found diaries everywhere, their leather and polymer covers soft with age. Some lay open on bedside tables, the final entries written in a frantic, sloping hand. Others were tucked neatly into drawers as if their owners intended to return to them. He did not read them yet, letting the objects tell their own story. A child's hand-knitted rabbit, missing an eye, sat propped on a pillow. A collection of polished stones, arranged in a spiral pattern on a shelf, spoke of someone who sought order and beauty. A faded photograph of a sunlit field, its colors bleached to sepia, was tacked to a wall, a window to a world that had died twice over. On a small desk, a set of handcrafted tools lay beside a half-carved piece of wood, the shape of a bird forever emerging from the grain. These were not the artifacts of cultists or rationalists, but of people, women who had been daughters, artists, thinkers, and dreamers before they were subjects in an experiment. Harlow ran his fingers over the carved bird, feeling the delicate grooves left by a blade held in a hand that had turned to dust centuries ago. A profound, aching weight settled in his chest, a sorrow so vast it felt like a physical pressure. The skeletons in the atrium had been anonymous, a collective tragedy, but here, in the quiet stillness of these rooms, each object was a voice. The weight was not just of lost lives, but of lost potential, of the small, daily joys and sorrows that had constituted a world. He saw the Chipped mug favored for morning tea, the worn spot on the floor where someone had paced, the carefully mended tear in a jumpsuit. This was the true intimacy of the horror, not the grand spectacle of violence, but the quiet, systematic erasure of 1,000 ordinary worlds. His exploration led him to the end of a particularly long corridor, a dead-end section that felt older, less frequently trafficked. Here the personal artifacts were sparser, the quarters more utilitarian, as if this area had been reserved for a different purpose. And there, set into the curved wall at the corridor's terminus, was a door unlike any he had seen. It was heavier, reinforced with secondary struts, and made of a darker, non-reflective metal. Most chillingly, it was marked, not with the circle or the gear, but with a series of stark, yellow and black warning symbols that had not faded with time. A bold biohazard trefoil was flanked by symbols for radiation and high voltage, and beneath them, stenciled in harsh block letters, were the words, "Quarantine authorized personnel only, Protocol 7 Alpha enforced." The door's seal was pristine, untouched by violence or decay, and the heavy-duty lock mechanism glinted with a cold, malevolent promise. It was a secret within a secret, a final, forbidden chamber in the heart of the nightmare, and its silent, warning-marked presence built a suspense that was thicker and more chilling than any echo of past violence. In the quiet gloom of a small, personal quarters, Harlow found her. Not her bones, those were long gone, scattered to dust, but her voice, preserved in the fragile pages of a leather-bound journal tucked beneath a threadbare mattress. The cover was soft and worn, the edges frayed from anxious fingers. Opening it felt like a violation, a trespass into a soul that had poured its deepest fears and fervent hopes onto the page. The script was elegant, flowing, a stark contrast to the harsh, printed manifests of the rationalists. The first entry he read was not a beginning, but a fragment from the middle of a story already steeped in devotion and dread. "The rationalists watch us with their cold, dead eyes," it began, the ink a faded brown like old blood. "They think our faith is a sickness, a flaw in their perfect, sterile world, but they are the ones who are empty. They have numbers and schematics, but we have we have purpose." The writer was Alara. The account was not a chronicle of events, but a window into the heart of the cult of the One. She described the rituals not as acts of control, but as moments of profound, personal transcendence. The lighting of salvaged candles in the shrine, the soft, communal chanting, the act of leaving a treasured possession at the foot of Leo's statuette, these were not political maneuvers to her. They were anchors in a sea of despair. "When I kneel before the altar of the One," she wrote, "the chill of the vault recedes. The constant hum of the machinery becomes a hymn. In that silence, I am not a subject, not a number. I am seen. I am part of something sacred. The rituals are not for him, they are for us. They are the only things that remind us we are more than just bodies waiting to expire." Her words painted a picture of a faith that provided genuine solace, a warmth kindled against the cold logic of their imprisonment. It was a comfort born from the very fanaticism that Harlow had found so unsettling, and in her earnest prose he could see its terrible, seductive appeal. Yet intertwined with this devotion was a sharp, pervasive fear. Alara's writing grew tighter, more frantic when she spoke of the rationalists. She saw them not as misguided, but as actively malevolent, a force of pure negation seeking to strip the world of all mystery and meaning. "They whisper in the corridors," she confided, her penmanship becoming jagged. "They call our faith a social pathogen. They would tear down our shrine and replace it with another terminal, another set of equations that explain nothing and feel even less. They want to reduce Leo to a biological function, a component to be studied and stored. They do not understand that he is the heart of this place, and without a heart a body dies. Their order is the order of the grave." Her fear was palpable, a genuine terror that the rationalists would succeed in their cold, utilitarian crusade, leaving the vault a perfectly maintained, utterly soulless tomb. Harlow closed the diary, the soft thud of the cover echoing in the silent room. He looked around at the few personal effects left behind, a woven bracelet on the bedside table, a drawing of a flower pinned to the wall. This was not the quarters of a fanatic in the abstract. It was the home of a woman who had sought beauty and connection in a world designed to deny both. Her devotion to Leo and the cult was, for her, the only path to meaning. He felt a surprising surge of sympathy for Alara, for the raw, human need that pulsed beneath the layers of dogma. The fanaticism of the cult had led to violence and control. He knew that from the other records. But in this single, intimate account, he saw its origin not in malice, but in a desperate, deeply human search for significance in the face of an existential void. She was an unreliable narrator, her truth filtered through the lens of her belief, but her humanity was undeniable. Her story was a tragic reminder that the search for meaning, when trapped in a cage, could curdle into the very thing that destroyed it. To be a god was to be a specimen, pinned and wriggling under 1,000 watchful eyes. Leo's existence had become a curated performance, his every breath a data point, his every gesture a scripture to be interpreted and weaponized by warring factions. His private quarters, which Harlow now stood within, were the ultimate testament to this paradox. It was the most sparsely furnished room he had yet encountered, a cell of stark functionality. A narrow cot was bolted. Floor, its mattress thin and unyielding. A single metal desk and chair stood against one wall, devoid of any personal item. There were no mementos, no art, no trace of an individual soul. The only nod to his unique status was the bank of 3 small monitors mounted high on the wall, their dark lenses staring down at the empty space where he would have slept, eaten, and existed. They were unblinking, mechanical sentinels, ensuring the god never had a moment of unobserved humanity. Logs recovered from a heavily encrypted personal terminal painted a picture of a man drowning in the shallow waters of his own significance. Leo wrote of his early futile attempts to mediate, to be a bridge between the circle and the gear. He had tried to speak to the rationalists in their own language of logic, suggesting resource-sharing protocols and mediated discussions. They had listened with polite, condescending patience, then dismissed his ideas as emotionally compromised variables. He had tried to appeal to the cult's purported compassion, begging for a reduction in the rituals, for a moment of simple, unscripted silence. They had wept at his feet, calling it a divine test of their faith, their devotion only intensifying. Every attempt to connect, to be seen as a man and not a symbol, only cemented his role further. He was isolated at the very center of a 1,000-person universe, the pressure of their collective need a constant, crushing weight on his spirit. Harlow moved through the sterile space, his light glinting off the monitoring lenses. In a hidden compartment beneath the desk's false bottom, he found the only truly personal item in the room, a small, standard-issue datapad, its power cell long dead. Using a portable charger from his pack, he watched the screen flicker to life. It was a diary, but unlike Alara's fervent outpourings, Leo's entries were terse, bleak, and filled with a quiet, building despair. They were the scratchings of a man trying to carve his own name on the walls of a prison that worshipped him. He wrote of the suffocating nature of the worship, the horror of seeing his own face rendered in reverent sketches on the shrine walls. He described the terror of the symbolic marriages, the feeling of his personhood being ritually dismantled and reassembled into an icon. One entry, dated mere months before the final collapse, cut to the bone of his loneliness. The words were simple, stripped of all pretense, a raw nerve exposed on the digital page. They have taken my name, my voice, my choices. They have given me a crown of wires and a throne of scrap metal. They leave offerings of food I did not ask for and pledge vows to a ghost they created. In their eyes, I am either a key or a component, never a man. I would trade all of it, the deference, the protection, the hollow divinity, for one real conversation. For one person to look at me and see Leo, not the one. To sit in a room with someone who does not want anything from me, who not waiting for a sign or a function, just to be seen, just to be heard. Is that too much for a god to ask? It is the only miracle I will ever pray for. It was a cry to Kerr from the depths of profound isolation, the yearning of a soul trapped in a gilded cage, starving for the simple, genuine connection that the vault's twisted society had rendered impossible. The fragile illusion of Leo's autonomy shattered completely when the first whispers of the fertility system's decay began to circulate. It started as a rumor in the hydroponics bay, a technician's offhand comment about a fluctuation in the water purification metrics. But in the pressure cooker atmosphere of the vault, that single spark ignited a firestorm of new and terrifying debates. The carefully maintained barrier, the very cornerstone of the Vault Tech experiment, was showing its first hairline fractures, and suddenly, Leo was no longer just a symbol or a pawn. He became a biological imperative, a contested resource, and a brutal new war over the future itself. His life became a scheduled series of humiliations, his body a political battleground. The rationalists, in their cold pragmatism, insisted on a regime of intensified medical monitoring. They subjected him to daily blood draws and genetic screenings, their touch clinical and impersonal, their eyes seeing only a dataset of declining sperm viability and hormonal stress markers. They debated in logs he was never meant to see, the merits of enforced cryopreservation of his genetic material versus keeping him active as a controlled variable. Meanwhile, the cult of the One interpreted the system's potential failure as a divine sign, a long-awaited Genesis event. Their rituals became more possessive, more physically intrusive. They began anointing him with oils said to promote virility, their chants now laced with a desperate, procreative fervor. He was pulled in 2 directions at once, toward the cold storage of a laboratory specimen or the heated altar of a breeding god. In both futures he was merely a function, his humanity irrelevant. The psychological toll was meticulously documented, not out of compassion, but as part of the experiment's data. Logs from this period, accessed by Harlow, showed a steep and harrowing decline. Entries noted increased instances of dissociative episodes, where Leo would be found staring blankly at a wall for hours, unresponsive to his name. His sleep patterns disintegrated into fractured, nightmare-riddled cycles. The man who had once yearned for genuine connection now recoiled from all touch, his eyes holding a hollow, hunted look. The pressure had eroded him from the inside, leaving behind a brittle shell of the person he had once been. He was a clockwork man winding down toward a silent, inevitable stop. Harlow, piecing together the final stages of this erosion, found evidence of Leo's last, desperate grasp at selfhood. In a ventilation shaft near his quarters, hidden behind a loose panel, was a small, crude toolkit, a filed-down spoon, a sharpened piece of metal. Scratches on the inside of the panel formed a single, repeated word, no. In the medical bay, a corrupted log fragment described an unapproved alteration attempt on the primary fertility control console, an act of sabotage that had resulted in a security lockdown and Leo being placed under 24-hour watch. These were not the calculated moves of a revolutionary, but the frantic, hopeless struggles of a cornered animal. They were the last sparks of a dying will, attempts to break the machine that was grinding him into dust. He had tried to rebel against his fate, not with grand speeches or organized resistance, but with the only pathetic tools left to him, a sharpened spoon and a desperate, silent scream into the void. The ultimate exploitation was complete. They had not only used his body and his spirit, but they had crushed his final, feeble attempts to reclaim them, leaving him with nothing, not even the dignity of his own despair. The sterile hum of the vault was the first thing to change. For years it had been a constant, a subliminal drone of perfect artificial order. Then one day it faltered, a subtle shift in pitch, a faint, discordant vibration that resonated in the metal bones of the structure. It was a sound so slight that most would have dismissed it as imagination, but in a world where every variable was monitored and controlled, it was a thunderclap. The automated fertility suppression system, the invisible cage that had defined their existence, was failing. The first sign was not a siren or an alarm, but a quiet, creeping panic that spread through the vault like a nerve agent, turning whispered fears into a palpable, suffocating dread. Chaos erupted not with a bang, but with a frantic, disbelieving whisper in the medical bay. A woman, pale and trembling, held a diagnostic slate whose results defied a decade of enforced certainty. The chemical barrier had degraded. Pregnancy, the impossible dream and the unspoken terror, was now a biological possibility. The news tore through the factions with the force of a physical blow. For the cult of the One, it was a miracle made manifest, a divine validation of their faith. Their celebrations were feverish, ecstatic, their chants now prayers for fertility and a new genesis. For the rationalists, it was their worst-case scenario realized, the collapse of the primary control, the unleashing of uncontrollable biological and social variables. Their response was immediate and cold: quarantine, lockdown, and frantic attempts to reroute systems and re-establish the chemical barrier, their actions fueled by a terror of the chaotic, emotional future they saw barreling toward them. The vault descended into a new kind of war, fought not with laser pistols but with ideology and control over the body. The cult, seeing their chance to secure their legacy, began to enforce their own brutal protocols, pressuring women to seek Leo's blessing, turning procreation into a sacred duty. The rationalists, in turn, declared any attempt at pregnancy an act of treason against the vault's stability, advocating for draconian measures up to and including forced sterilization to maintain the failing order. The medical bay became a battleground, its pristine floors stained with the evidence of ideological rifts. Frantic notes passed between sympathetic nurses, logs detailing arguments that turned physical, and reports of women suffering miscarriages or severe medical emergencies from crude, back-alley attempts to either induce or prevent conception using salvaged chemicals and desperation. Harlow, navigating the aftermath centuries later, found the epicenter of this collapse in the vault's environmental control center. The room was a graveyard of machinery, its consoles smashed and pried open, their intricate wiring torn out in frantic, desperate attempts at repair or sabotage. He knelt, his light illuminating scatter of polymer slips tucked beneath a shattered terminal. They were not official logs, but the frantic, handwritten notes of a rationalist technician, her script degenerating from neat precision to a terrified scrawl. Dosage levels critical, cannot stabilize the inhibitor matrix. Cultists have sabotaged the primary intake valve. They want this. They want the chaos. 2 confirmed pregnancies in Sector G. Medical override failed. We are losing control. The order is breaking. God help us, the order is breaking. The notes were a stark testament to the collapse of the artificial world they had all inhabited, the moment the meticulously constructed walls of their reality crumbled, leaving them exposed to the raw, terrifying potential of a future they were never meant to have. The quiet hum of the vault's machinery was now a backdrop to a new, more menacing sound, the sharp, purposeful rhythm of preparation. The ideological chasm between the circle and the gear had widened. No man's land of simmering hostility, and the first, tentative skirmishes had proven that words were no longer the currency of conflict. In the dimly lit corridors, small, violent encounters flared like brush fires, a patrol of rationalists, armed with shock batons, would clash with a group of cultists guarding a shrine entrance, the brief, brutal exchange leaving behind bruised bodies and a deeper, more personal hatred. These were not yet battles for territory, but tests of resolve, each one hardening the lines between the two dominant factions and pushing them closer to the precipice of total war. Amidst this polarization, smaller, more pragmatic groups began to coalesce in the shadows. These were the unaligned, the disillusioned, the ones who saw the fanaticism of the cult and the cold tyranny of the rationalists as two paths to the same grave. They formed tight-knit tribal units for pure survival, scavenging from disused sectors and hoarding supplies in hidden caches. They trusted no one outside their small circles, their loyalties forged not by ideology but by the simple, desperate need to see another sunrise. The Vault was no longer a society of two halves. It was a fractured landscape of armed camps, each preparing for a storm they all knew was coming. The logs from this period, which Harlow painstakingly reconstructed, shifted in tone from observation to active strategizing. The Rationalist manifests detailed the systematic stockpiling of energy cells and medical supplies in secure locations, their language cold and efficient. The cult's records, more fervent and apocalyptic, spoke of forging weapons in hidden workshops and creating propaganda posters that depicted the rationalists as soulless automatons seeking to extinguish the sacred spark of life. Both sides were building their arsenals, both material and ideological, preparing for a conflict that would decide the soul and the future of Vault 56, wandering through a sublevel maintenance tunnel. Harlow's light fell upon a section of wall that had been meticulously cleared of grime. Etched into the metal, not with the crude scratches of a single individual, but with the precise, coordinated effort of a military operation, was a vast, detailed battle plan. It was a map of the Vault's central corridors and key sectors, overlaid with tactical arrows, marked choke points, and designations for defensive positions and supply depots. The symbols used were a mix of the rationalist gear and the cult's circle, a chilling cartography of the coming civil war. This was not a theoretical exercise. It was a blueprint for the systematic conquest of their own home, a plan to turn living quarters and common areas into killing fields. In a small, secluded nook near the hydroponics bay, Harlow found another diary, this one belonging to a woman named Kaylin, who identified with neither faction. Her entries were a litany of escalating fear. "They are sharpening blades in the old generator room," she wrote, her hand trembling on the page. "I heard them, the metallic scrape, the low, serious voices. The rationalists have taken control of the primary water purifier. The cult talks of a great cleansing to come. No one speaks of Leo anymore, not as a man. He is just the prize, the flag to be captured. I've hidden what food I can, taught my daughter the quietest places to hide. The air tastes of metal and hate. We are a clock counting down, and I can only hold her and pray the tolling does not find us." Her words were a whisper from the edge of the abyss, the voice of an ordinary soul trapped between two gathering armies, fearing the impending violence that promised to leave no one untouched. It began not with a declaration, but with a desperate, grasping hand. The cult of the One, driven to a fever pitch by the failing systems and their own eschatological beliefs, made their move. They had decided the time for rituals and reverence was over, the time for possession had come. A group of them, armed with tools and a fanatic's conviction, stormed the corridor leading to Leo's quarters, intent on seizing him, on taking their god to a place of safety where he could usher in their prophesied new age. They never reached his door. The rationalists, having anticipated this exact play, were waiting. They had turned the corridor into a kill zone, using overturned storage lockers and welded plating to create a fortified position from which they could defend their most critical asset, the man they now saw as the last, volatile component in a disintegrating experiment. The first shot was a searing lance of crimson light that cut through the gloom, striking a cultist in the shoulder and spinning her to the ground with a scream that was more shock than pain. It was a sound the Vault had not heard in its entire history, the sound of one resident intentionally harming another. For a single, suspended moment, there was silence, broken only by the sizzle of scorched fabric and the woman's ragged sobs. Then the corridor erupted. Laser fire painted the walls in brief, violent strokes of red and blue. The clang of metal on metal echoed as shock batons met wrenches and crowbars. It was not a battle of soldiers, but of engineers, botanists, and archivists, their faces contorted in a rictus of terror and rage as they tore each other apart over the silent, terrified man locked behind his door. In the aftermath, the silence that returned was heavier, tainted. The logs from that day were fragments of shock and grief, the clinical detachment of the rationalists and the fervent prose of the cultists, both shattered by the new, brutal reality. A rationalist medic's log was a staccato report of casualties, listing names and injuries with a voice trembling on the edge of control. A cultist's diary entry from that night was a raw wound of anguish and fury, vowing eternal vengeance for the martyrs who had fallen. The brief, bloody clash in that single corridor had done what years of ideological disagreement could not. It had made the enmity absolute. The Circle and the Gear were no longer rival philosophies, they were sworn enemies, their hands now stained with each other's blood. The point of no return had been crossed, and the path ahead led only deeper into the heart of civil war. Centuries later, Harlow Vance stood in that same corridor. The barricades were dust, the weapons rusted husks, but the story was still written on the floor. His lantern beam illuminated two skeletons, locked in a final, intimate embrace of death. They had fallen together, their bones intertwined in a way that suggested they had been grappling at the moment. A lethal energy blast had caught them both. One clutched the rusted remains of a rationalist's shock baton. The fingers of the other were curled around the faded fabric of a tunic, bearing the faint, ghostly outline of a circle. They had killed each other, their mutual hatred so absolute it had transcended their own. Survival. Harlow looked from their remains to the scarred, pockmarked walls, feeling the chilling finality of the moment. This was not an accident or a skirmish, it was the first blood, the catalyst. From this point on, Vault 56 was no longer a society, it was a battlefield. The sealed door at the end of the corridor was a scar on the vault's skin, a deliberate, final act of concealment. The warning symbols glared in the beam of Harlow's lantern, their yellow and black stark and unnervingly fresh against the aged metal. Protocol 7 Alpha. The words were a final, bureaucratic whisper of the horror that lay within. He worked with a grim, focused intensity, his hydraulic jack groaning as it forced the reinforced struts to bend, the shriek of tortured metal a violation of the tomb-like silence. With a final, shuddering crack, the seal broke, and the door swung inward on protesting hinges, releasing a puff of cold, dry air that carried the unmistakable, chalky scent of ancient death. The chamber beyond was not a room, it was a charnel house. His light swept across a scene of systematic, brutal finality. Dozens of skeletons lay in neat, ghastly rows, their positions not those of combat or panic, but of execution. They were on their knees, their spinal columns aligned, their skulls bowed or lying a short distance away where they had fallen after a precise, violent separation. There were no weapons clutched in their hands, no defensive wounds on their bones. They had been lined up and dispatched, a purge enacted with cold, dispassionate efficiency. The walls were riddled with the concentrated pockmarks of laser fire, all emanating from a single direction, the doorway where Harlow now stood. This was not a battle, it was a slaughter. His eyes, accustomed to the vault's horrors, scanned the room, and his breath caught in his throat. Near the back, separate from the rows, was a single skeleton that was different. It was not kneeling, but lay sprawled on its side, one arm outstretched as if in a final, futile reach. The pelvic structure was subtly, undeniably male. A cold certainty settled in Harlow's gut. Leo. He had not died of illness or in the crossfire of the Civil War. He had been brought here to this hidden chamber and executed. The man who had been a god, a pawn, and a prisoner had met his end as a problem to be permanently solved. Driven by a rising, sickening urgency, Harlow pushed past the grisly tableau, his boots crunching on bone fragments. Tucked into an alcove, camouflaged by shadow and a fallen ceiling panel, was a low console, its screen dark. It was a terminal, its design different from the others, more robust, more secretive. He powered it, his fingers trembling slightly, the green glow illuminating his face, a mask of dread and determination. The system booted, but the screen was a mess of digital corruption, files scrambled into near incoherence. He could make out fragments of text, the ghost of a log. Execution Protocol 7A enacted, subject Leo, termination confirmed, purge of associated personnel, log corrupted. The story was here, the final damning confession, but it was shattered, its truth locked behind layers of digital decay. The horror was no longer an abstract tragedy from the past, it was a visceral, immediate reality. He was standing in the room where it had happened, surrounded by the victims, staring at the corrupted record of their murder, and the weight of it pressed down on him, a physical, suffocating force. He had found the heart of the vault's darkness, and it was colder and more brutal than he had ever imagined. The terminal screen flickered, a dying heart struggling to beat one last time. Harlow's fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing corrupted sectors and rewriting broken command lines with the grim focus of a coroner performing an autopsy. He was no longer just an explorer, he was a witness, and this machine held the testimony of the final, unforgivable sin. After an eternity of digital CPR, the screen stabilized, resolving into a single, chillingly coherent file. The header was stark and official, devoid of any identifying mark save for a string of numbers and the title, Internal Security Memorandum Incident 7 Alpha. It was the rationalist's account of Leo's end, and it was a masterpiece of ideological justification, a narrative so coldly spun it froze the blood in Harlow's veins. The log entry was a clinical dissection of a necessary excision. It framed Leo not as a man, but as a primary instability catalyst, a rogue variable whose continued existence threatened the structural integrity of the entire vault. It detailed in dispassionate prose how his symbolic value had been weaponized by the deviant faction to foment insurrection and undermine critical systems. The failure of the fertility suppression was laid at his feet, not as a technical fault, but as a consequence of the irrational fervor he inspired. The decision for termination was presented not as murder, but as a systemic stabilization protocol, a tragic but logical step to preserve the greater good. The language was that of a mechanic discarding a faulty part, the prose so dry it seemed to suck all the moisture from the air. There was no mention of his name, only his designation. There was no acknowledgement of his humanity, only his function, or rather, his malfunction. Yet the vault's walls told another story, one that screamed in silent counterpoint to the terminal's lies. As Harlow read the log's final, chilling line, protocol enacted, stability is the paramount objective, his ears caught the faint, almost imperceptible sound of weeping. It was not in the air, but in the very metal around him. Scratched into the baseboards, hidden in the shadowed corners of the execution chamber, were tiny, frantic symbols, the cult's circle again and again, carved with such force the metal was gouged, and beside them words etched by trembling, desperate hands. Martyr, they killed our hope, forgive us one. These were the ghosts of the mourners, the believers who had seen their God not decommissioned, but martyred. Their truth was one of sacrilege and world-ending loss, a narrative of divine murder that stood in stark, screaming opposition to the rationalists' sterile report. The log was a lie, a biased narration crafted by the victors to sanitize their brutality, and the very walls of the room were its indictment. Driven by a need for physical, undeniable proof, Harlow turned from the terminal and knelt beside the lone male skeleton. His light played over the bones, searching for the truth that the log had tried to erase. He found it on the fourth rib, a clean, cauterized hole consistent with a high-powered laser rifle shot to the back, an executioner's wound. But there was more. Clutched in the skeleton's outstretched hand, so small it had been overlooked, was a locket. Harlow pried the fragile metal open. Inside was not a picture, but a single, coiled strand of dark hair, identical to the one he had seen in the shrine. It was a final, desperate keepsake, a token from a believer, pressed into his hand perhaps moments before the end. This was not the death of a threat to stability. It was the murder of a man who, in his final moments, had been shown a fragment of the genuine devotion he had always craved. The physical evidence did not verify the log's account. It utterly refuted it, revealing the brutal reality of ideological purity, a cold, logical framework that demanded the destruction of anything and anyone that did not fit its perfect, monstrous equation. The first shot in the corridor had been a spark in a tinderbox of long-suppressed rage and fear, and the ensuing explosion tore the last vestiges of society apart. The Civil War did not erupt, it detonated, consuming the sterile corridors and humming chambers of Vault 56 in a firestorm of internecine violence. The battle lines, once scratched as symbols on walls, were now drawn in laser fire and blood. The central atrium became a no-man's land, a killing field where the cult's fervent charges broke against the rationalists' fortified barricades. The air, once recycled to sterile perfection, grew thick with the acrid stench of ozone from energy weapons, the coppery tang of blood, and the choking dust of pulverized concrete. The war was fought with a horrifying ingenuity. The vault's very infrastructure turned against its inhabitants. Maintenance tunnels became ambush routes, ventilation shafts carried the whispers of spies and the moans of the dying. Makeshift weapons were forged in the hydroponics bay, pruning shears lashed to pipes, nutrient solutions boiled into caustic projectiles. The rationalists, with their superior knowledge of the vault systems, engineered cruel traps. They rerouted power to electrify handrails, jury-rigged door mechanisms to crush unsuspecting intruders, and flooded entire sectors with non-lethal but disorienting neuroagent, turning hallways into hallucinogenic gauntlets. The cult, driven by divine fury, responded with traps of their own, pits lined with sharpened rebar hidden under loose floor panels, and deadfalls triggered by tripwires in the shrine's antechamber. Harlow moved through this landscape of ancient carnage, the scars of the war etched into every surface. Navigated corridors where the walls were shredded, not by a single battle, but by the relentless, grinding conflict of a war of attrition. He found rooms that had been converted into field hospitals, their floors still stained with dark, permanent blooms where the wounded had bled out. In a communal kitchen, a last, desperate meal of synthesized protein lay fossilized on plates. The skeletons of the diners slumped over the table, caught in a moment of fleeting peace before the violence found them. The environment itself was a testament to the descent into chaos, a place where every doorway could conceal an ambush and every shadow could hide a corpse. The logs from this period, fragmented and frantic, spoke of a world coming undone. They were no longer the calm reports of sociologists or the fervent prayers of devotees, but the terse, terrified communiques of soldiers and survivors. One corrupted file listed casualties in a cold, rolling tally, the numbers climbing into the hundreds. Another occultist's final scrawl described the horror of seeing a sister-in-arms, a woman she had known for a decade, defect to a new mercenary group that preyed on both sides for supplies. Alliances shifted like sand, trust became a fatal liability, and new, smaller factions formed around the basest of instincts, pure predatory survival. The grand ideological war between faith and reason had shattered into 1,000 petty, brutal conflicts, a Hobbesian nightmare where life was not just solitary and poor, but decidedly nasty, brutish, and short. The vault had become a closed ecosystem of violence feeding on itself until nothing would remain. The war ceased to be a clash of ideologies and became a grinding machine of pure annihilation. The propaganda, once a tool for recruitment, mutated into a weapon of psychological warfare designed to strip the enemy of their very humanity. The rationalists' manifests now referred to cultists not as misguided, but as biologically regressive units, emotional contagions, and cancerous growths on the social body. In turn, the cult's broadcasts denounced the rationalists as hollow men, soulless automatons, and blasphemers against life itself. This calculated dehumanization did its poisonous work, eroding the last barriers of conscience. Atrocities, once unthinkable, became standard tactics. Harlow found evidence of a sealed dormitory where the air had been vented, skeletons huddled near the sealed vents. In another sector, he discovered a barricade made not of furniture, but of skeletons, their bones wired together in a ghastly wall of triumph and terror. The logs from this final desperate phase were no longer chronicles of battle, but the choked confessions of broken souls. A rationalist soldier's audio diary, her voice a ragged whisper, described clearing a nursery-turned shrine. She spoke of the small, woven bracelets on the tiny skeletons, of the impossibility of reconciling the targets with the children they had once been. Recording ended with the sound of a single, suppressed sob, then the click of the recorder being switched off forever. Occultist's final written entry was a rambling, incoherent screed, alternating between vows of vengeance and pleas for forgiveness, the ink blotted by tears, the letters trailing off the page as if the writer had simply ceased to exist mid-thought. The survivors were drowning in a sea of guilt and despair, their minds buckling under the weight of the horrors they had both witnessed and perpetrated. Amidst this catalogue of despair, Harlow found small, defiant embers of humanity that had refused to be extinguished. In a medic's satchel tucked between rolls of faded bandages was a diary that told a different story. Its author, a woman who had refused to wear any faction's symbol, documented her secret, moonlit journeys through the war-torn vault. She wrote of risking her life to leave caches of water and medical supplies in neutral zones, of treating the wounded from both sides in a hidden closet, judging them only by their pain. One entry described pulling a rationalist engineer and a cultist devotee, both mortally wounded, into the same small space. In their final moments, stripped of their ideologies, they had held hands, two terrified women finding a fragment of comfort in their shared, dying humanity. These moments were not victories, they changed nothing of the vault's fate, but they were a quiet, powerful rebellion against the totalizing hatred that surrounded them. The most poignant of these artifacts was a single, worn datapad found on the body of a soldier, curled in a fetal position in a supply closet. The final entry was not about strategy or faith, but about loss. The author, her script shaky, did not mention the circle or the gear. She wrote of a woman named Lynn, her voice, her laugh, the way her hand felt. She described a shared meal of stolen fruit in the hydroponics bay, a memory so vivid and peaceful it felt like a dream from another life. The entry ended with a simple, devastating line. They told me she was a gear mark, an enemy to be purged. I pulled the trigger. I followed the order. The war is everywhere now, but it is loudest inside my own head. Lynn is gone, and I am the hollow man they said we were fighting. I am so tired. I just want to hear her laugh again. It was the reflection of a soldier who had lost not just her comrades, but her own soul to the machinery of war, a final, heartbreaking testament to the true cost of the conflict that had consumed Vault 56. The war had bled the vault dry, leaving behind a hollowed-out carcass of its former self, populated by ghosts who had not yet realized they were dead. The great ideological engines of the cult and the rationalists had ground to a halt, their fuel, faith, and logic alike exhausted in the furnace of mutual destruction. What remained were not factions, but scattered, feral bands of survivors, their numbers so diminished that the vast, echoing corridors felt like a deserted continent. They haunted the ruins, no longer fighting for a future, but merely existing in the lengthening shadow of a certain creeping end. The air grew colder as damaged climate control systems whined their final protests, and a new, sinister scent began to permeate the stale atmosphere, the faint, metallic tang of radiation, seeping from cracked reactors shielding that no one had the skill or will left to repair. Starvation was the new, silent enemy. The hydroponics bays, once lush with engineered life, were now graveyards of withered plants and shattered glass, their automated nutrient systems hopelessly corrupted. The survivors scoured the pick-clean storage rooms, fighting over cans of protein paste that had been hidden away for centuries, their contents sometimes more poison than sustenance. The logs from this terminal period were no longer narratives. They were stark, desperate inventories of dwindling supplies, lists of names crossed out one by one, and fragmented, half-mad ramblings. One entry from a woman who had once been a botanist described boiling her own boots for the trace nutrients in the leather. Another simply repeated the same phrase over and over until it filled the screen. So hungry, so cold, so dark, hope was not just vanished, it was a forgotten concept, a child's story from a time when the sun was more than a memory. The final, fragile bonds of community shattered completely under the weight of extinction. The last vestiges of the old factions fractured into solitary, paranoid existences. What little trust remained curdled into a predatory desperation. Harlow found evidence of this ultimate isolation in a series of barricaded rooms, each one a solitary fortress where a final occupant had died alone, surrounded by hoarded scraps, their skeletons often showing signs of violence from fellow survivors, not old enemies. The war was over, but the peace was the peace of the grave, and in the long, slow approach to it, the last of their humanity was stripped away, leaving only the raw animal instinct to survive one more hour, even at the cost of another's last. It was in the overseer's abandoned office, amidst a pile of discarded data slates, that Harlow made his most chilling discovery. A single intact log, its header marked Final COMMUNIQUE, contained the last coherent words from the vault's dying heart. The author's identity was lost, the tone eerily calm, a serenity born of absolute despair. It spoke of a consensus reached among the last 24 survivors, a final, terrible solution to the unendurable suffering. They had gathered the vault's remaining stockpile of sedatives from the ruined medbay. The log did not describe it as suicide, but as a final communion, a collective closing of the eyes. It hinted at a ritual, a last stand not against an enemy, but against the slow, degrading agony of their end. The final line was a simple, haunting instruction to any who might someday find them. The pain ends where it began. We go to the heart, do not wake us. The words hung in the cold air, a testament to the inevitable conclusion of a society driven to its absolute limit, choosing a controlled, collective end over the chaotic, lonely gnawing of extinction. The experiment was complete, and its final data point was a quiet, deliberate surrender to the darkness. The final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with the grim finality of a tomb door sealing shut. Harlow stood amidst the scattered data slates and personal artifacts. In the overseer's office, the ghostly whispers of 1,000 lost lives swirling in the cold, still air. He was no longer piecing together a mystery. He was bearing witness to an autopsy of the human soul. The terror of Vault 56 had never been a monster from the outside, a plague or a radiation leak. It was a cancer that had grown from within, fed by the very conditions of their existence. The true horror was not what had been done to these people, but what they had done to each other. He saw the entire tragic arc with a devastating clarity. It began with the cold, scientific arrogance of the Vault-Tec experiment, a premise designed to fracture and corrupt. He saw the initial confusion of the women, the unbearable pressure placed on Leo. The man made first a specimen, then a symbol, and finally a sacrifice. He traced the hairline cracks of early resentment as they widened into the chasm of ideological war, the noble intentions of both faith and reason curdling into the fanaticism of the cult and the cold tyranny of the rationalists. The failing fertility system had not been the cause, but the catalyst that poured acid into these fissures, turning a cold war into a hot one, and then into a scorched earth policy of mutual annihilation. The skeletons in the atrium, the executed in the hidden chamber, the starved and the solitary in their barricaded rooms, they were all victims of the same internal strife. The enemy had always been their own reflection, twisted and magnified in the pressure cooker of their sealed world. A profound, aching sorrow welled up in Harlow's chest, so vast and heavy it threatened to buckle his knees. It was not the detached pity of an explorer for long-dead subjects, but a deep, empathetic grief for the sheer, stupid waste of it all. He thought of Alara seeking solace in a manufactured god, of Leo yearning for a single genuine connection in a world that saw him only as a function, of the anonymous medic tending to the wounded from both sides of the soldier mourning her lost love. These were not data points in a failed experiment. They were people. They had laughed, loved, created, and hoped, and all of it had been systematically crushed under the weight of a design that pitted them against one another until nothing was left but dust and bones and the echo of their suffering. The weight of this understanding crashed down upon him all at once. The professional detachment he had worn like a shield shattered into a million pieces. He stumbled back from the console, his breath catching in a ragged sob. The sterile, recycled air of the vault felt like a physical poison in his lungs. He sank to his knees, the cold of the metal floor seeping through his trousers, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The images flooded his mind: the child's toy, the half-carved bird, the final desperate plea in Leo's diary, the intertwined skeletons of the first casualties. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat, a raw expression of the horror that was not out there in the wasteland, but right here, in the terrifying potential of the human heart. He wept for them, for the thousand lives extinguished not by a cataclysm, but by the slow, insidious poison of fear, power, and desperation. He wept until his body was spent, until there was nothing left but the hollowed-out silence and the crushing, definitive truth. The greatest monsters were the ones they had created for themselves. The silence that followed Harlow's tears was a different kind of quiet. It was no longer the empty hush of a tomb, but a resonant, heavy stillness, thick with the accumulated weight of centuries of suffering. He rose from the cold floor, his body aching, his mind scraped raw. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of stark, terrible clarity. He was no longer just a scavenger in a ruin. He was an archivist standing in the library of a human catastrophe, and the ghostly voices of Vault 56 were no longer whispers of mystery, but a unified, damning testimony. He understood now that their story was not an anomaly, but a dark mirror held up to the very nature of humanity under pressure. His thoughts turned outward to the sun-scorched, wind-whipped hellscape beyond the vault's sealed door. The wasteland was a monument to a different kind of failure, a grand, geopolitical experiment in mutual assured destruction. But the parallels were undeniable. Out there, tribes warred over patches of fertile soil and clean water, dehumanizing their enemies with different paints but the same brutal brush. Charismatic leaders rose, promising salvation and demanding absolute loyalty, their cults of personality echoing the fervent chants in the shrine. The strong preyed upon the weak, and the logic of survival often crushed the softer impulses of compassion and community. Vault 56 was not a unique perversion of human nature. It was a concentrated, accelerated microcosm of it. The same forces of power, belief, and tribalism that had shattered this sealed world were the very engines that drove the cyclical conflicts of the world outside. The horror was not that this could happen, but that it always did, in endless, bloody repetition. This realization settled upon him not as a burden of despair, but as a grim, sobering responsibility. To leave this place, to seal the door and let the dust settle once more, would be to commit the ultimate act of disrespect. It would be to condemn these thousand souls to be truly forgotten, their agonizing lessons dying with them. Their story was a warning, a detailed map of the path from order to chaos, from community to carnage. It was a testament to how quickly belief could curdle into fanaticism, how logic could freeze into tyranny, and how the desperate need for meaning could be twisted into a weapon of self-destruction. The memory of this place, preserved and shared, was the only monument these people would ever have. It was the only thing that could give their senseless deaths a fragment of meaning, a resolve cold and hard as the vault's metal walls crystallized within him. He would not be just a witness, he would be a chronicler. He moved with a new purpose, no longer just exploring but curating. He gathered the most poignant artifacts: Alara's diary, Leo's final datapad, the rationalist manifests, the soldier's heartbreaking confession. He downloaded every corrupted log and fragmented file, creating multiple backups on hardened data drives from his pack. He was building an ark, not of animals, but of evidence, carrying the entire tragic history of Vault 56 out of its grave. This story would not die here. It would be his duty, his penance for having intruded upon their suffering, to ensure that the weight of this history was felt by others. It would be a stark, unflinching reminder that the greatest threats to humanity were not the mutants or the radiation, but the monsters that slept in the human heart, waiting for the right conditions of fear, isolation, and imbalance to awaken and devour their world from the inside out. The weight was no longer just emotional. It was a physical load, a tangible burden strapped to his back and clutched in his hands. The satchel was heavy with the dead, its contents more precious and terrible than any salvage he had ever hauled from the ruins of the old world. Inside, nestled among his survival gear, were the diaries, the logs, the manifests, and the small, heartbreaking artifacts that constituted the soul of Vault 56. He could feel their presence with every step, 1,000 silent voices pressing against his spine, their collective tragedy a leaden anchor in the satchel's worn fabric. He was not just carrying records, he was carrying a plague of memory, a chronicle of a sickness he now had to spread to a world already sick unto death. He took one last, long look down the central corridor, his lantern beam a frail candle against the consuming darkness. The silence was no longer empty, it was layered, a sedimentary deposit of grief, rage, and final, weary surrender. He could almost see the ghosts, Althea marshalling her faithful, Isolde coldly calculating the odds of survival, Alara kneeling in fervent prayer, and Leo, forever trapped in his gilded cage, his eyes hollow with a loneliness so profound it had become a physical force in the room. They were all here, their stories imprinted on the cold metal, their final moments echoing in the perpetual hum of the failing machinery. He had come seeking a mystery and had found a mirror, and the reflection it showed was one he would carry for the rest of his days. Turning his back on the heart of the darkness, he retraced his steps through the skeletal remains of the atrium, past the scarred propaganda posters and the ghostly barricades. The journey out felt infinitely longer than the journey in, each footfall a conscious effort, as if the vault itself were a gravitational well trying to pull him back, to keep its secrets entombed. He finally reached the massive, circular door of the entrance hall, the outside world a mythic concept beyond several feet of reinforced steel. He placed his hands on the great wheel, the metal cold and unyielding. This was the final act, the symbolic burial. With a grunt of effort that was both physical and spiritual, he began to turn it. The mechanism groaned in protest, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to be the vault's final, mournful sigh. The door ground slowly shut, sealing the silence within, cutting off the past from the present, interring the horror once more. As the heavy bolt slid home with a series of definitive echoing clangs, Harlow Vance stood for a moment, his forehead resting against the cold metal. He was forever changed. The cynical scavenger who had entered was gone, replaced by a somber historian, a keeper of a terrible flame. The pain of knowing this story was a wound that would never fully heal. To share it would be to tear that wound open. Again and again to watch the same horror dawn on other faces, to feel the same crushing weight of the truth settle in other hearts. It would be a painful, wearying task, but a resolve as hard and unyielding as the door before him solidified in his core. He would bear this pain, he would share the story. The dead of Vault 56 would not be a forgotten footnote in a dead world's history. Their tragedy would be a warning, their silence given a voice through his own. He would make sure they were heard. The sun was a hammer on the broken land, its light a pale, merciless glare that bleached the color from the world. Harlow Vance stood on a rise of shattered asphalt, the wind pulling at his coat, carrying the fine, abrasive dust of a dead civilization. Behind him, hidden beneath the earth, Vault 56 slept once more, its horrors sealed behind tons of steel and silence. But he carried its echo within him, a resonance that had settled deep in his bones, altering the very frequency of his being. The desolation stretching before him was no longer just a wasteland. It was a testament, a vast, open grave that confirmed the terrible lesson he had learned in the dark. Humanity's greatest threats were not out here. They were not the rad scorpions lurking in the canyons, the packs of feral ghouls, or the bands of desperate raiders. Those were dangers of the flesh, problems that could be solved with a well-aimed rifle or a cleverly laid trap. The true monsters, the architects of true extinction, were internal. They were the ideologies that calcified into dogma, the hunger for power that masqueraded as a need for order, the desperate, beautiful lies of faith that curdled into fanaticism, and the cold, logical equations that justified any atrocity for the sake of a perceived greater good. The wasteland was merely the symptom, the disease was in the soul. Vault 56 was not an exception to the human rule. It was the rule, written in blood and bone and played out in a sealed, accelerated laboratory. His gaze swept across the horizon, a jagged line of ruined skyscrapers and blasted earth. Somewhere out there, hidden beneath the soil or nestled in forgotten mountains, were other vaults. Vault-Tec had seeded the continent with them, each one a unique and terrible experiment in human endurance. If Vault 56 was a study in gender imbalance and social fragmentation, what horrors had been engineered in the others? A vault designed to study paranoia, where the inhabitants were fed lies and turned against each other by an unseen overseer. A vault where the lights flickered at strange intervals to induce madness. A vault where art and beauty were forbidden to see how a culture would starve without them. The possibilities were endless, a gallery of human suffering curated by the cold, scientific minds of the old world. The unease that settled in his gut was a cold, permanent stone. The apocalypse had not been a single event. It had been 1,000 smaller ones playing out in these hidden steel tombs, each one a unique recipe for how to break the human spirit. He shifted the weight of his pack, the data drives and diaries inside feeling heavier than any physical load. Their legacy was not just a story of death, but a warning about life. The enduring impact of history was not that it repeated itself, but that its lessons were so easily ignored, its patterns so seductively familiar. The same forces that had torn Vault 56 apart were at work in every squabbling settlement, every nascent tribe vying for control of a water source, every charismatic leader demanding absolute loyalty. The past was not a foreign country. It was the very ground they walked on, and its echoes shaped every choice, every conflict, every fragile hope. Harlow took a final, deep breath of the dry, toxic air, then turned his back on the rise and began to walk. He did not know where he was going, only that he had to move. The story of Vault 56 was a burden he would now carry across the wastes, a ghost on his shoulder and a fire in his satchel. He would find those who would listen, who needed to hear the cautionary tale of a society that had looked inward for its enemy and found it in the mirror. The journey would be long and the telling would be painful, but the echo of the dead demanded it. They had perished in silence, but he would ensure their story was a voice on the wind, a whisper of warning that would, he hoped, endure long after his own footsteps had faded into the dust.